LeetCode 180 consecutive numbers. Now, this is going to be an interesting problem, but given a table, we just have to return all these respective values from the num column such that they've been repeated one or more times, 3 times consecutively. So, for instance, over here we have one again, we have one again, 3 times consecutively in a row. So we're going to be reporting that the number 1 follows this criteria. So how do we achieve that? So again, first thing we're going to do is just kind of have a table here to reference and, just kind of think about the solution here. So how can I programmatically receive these values, right, following this criteria? And a lot of times when it comes to consecutive numbers, those rank functions that we've discussed in other videos are very helpful. So we are going to be using one of those rank functions. But how is that actually going to help, right? So again, it helps to kind of model this out or, just kind of look at it visually. So if I was able to use a rank function, right, I would get, maybe rank 1 here and rank 2 here, rank 3, rank 4, 5, just kind of going down. That doesn't help us too much, right? But what would help us if maybe we reset this every time the number changes, right? So this 1, 2, 3 would continue, but then this 2 over here, if that was to maybe give us a 1, and then we saw 1 again here, so that would actually be 4, because if we were to kind of group this by number, right, the num column, you would have 1, 2, 3, you'd have 4 over here, and then for number 2, this would be the first occurrence of number 2. This would be the second occurrence. This would be down here, the third occurrence. And, well, first of all, how would this help? Well, this would help if we subtract the ID, assuming this is in incremental or sequential order, which, again, it is, because over here it says it's a primary key, but it's also auto incrementing starting from 1. So, 1, 2, 3, 4. If we were to take the difference between the ID and the rank, that would give us 0 over here, right? So we have a diff here. 1 minus 1 is 0. 2 minus 2 is 0. 3 minus 3 is 0. 4 minus 1 is actually 3. 5 minus 1 is actually 4. 6 minus 2 is 4. And 7 minus 3 is 4. Yeah, sorry. 5 minus 4 is 1. Excuse me. So how would this help? Well, this helps because if we had something like this, and we then maybe get a count of, all of this essentially the diff column here, and group it by the number and the difference to capture a count, you would get something like 3 for the number 1, right? Because you have 3 zeros here, right? If you were just to take a count. If you did this, if you looked at just the 3 over here, you would get 1. And that doesn't follow our criteria, so we could just filter for, all the rows, all the values where you have a row count of 3 or more. Similarly, over here, you would get, again, 1. Over here, you would get 2. So the only thing that would get picked up is this, number 1. And that's the solution here. So how do we go about coding this? Are there any kind of edge cases that you might want to think of? That's the time, this is the time to do it now. So one potential edge case that could maybe break this would be, again, we're just assuming that all of these values are here. What if someone actually deleted one of the records here, right? So essentially, let's say there was no row 3, right? Someone deleted row 3. And these IDs would essentially still be, auto incrementing, but because you now no longer have this value over here, the 3, when you go here to subtract 4 minus 3, you get 1. And now that's going to actually throw it off because these are actually sequential and you see 3 consecutive number 1s for the num column, but because the ID is off, that no longer works. So how do we care for that? Well, one way we could care for that, again, we could use the row number function, right? Because the row number function is going to ensure that it's definitely counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's not having any holes. So maybe one thing we could do here is completely disregard the ID column, make our own ID column using row number, and that's going to ensure there are no holes in the data and that we can actually compute the difference correctly. So that's probably the best way to move forward. So now how do we kind of code this, right? And let's just do it step by step. So let's say we had, a CTE with our kind of like our base table, right? So with base as, and all we're going to be doing, right? Again, we're going to basically just have this. We're going to have the ID, the number, and the rank, only because you can't have the difference within that same CTE, because you are going to be using two window functions to compute that. So it's going to have to be a derived table. So what I mean is, for now, let's just worry about this. So again, essentially we just had the ID column, we had the num, and then we can use any function here for this purpose. It could be rank, it could also be dense rank, doesn't really matter. But we're going to be ranking over, and again, remember that it has to reset when the number changes, right? So how do we do that? Well, first, we know the sequence is just going to be in the order of the ID here, right? So it is going to be ordered by ID, right? So that's why this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, because it's just going in the sequence of the ID here, ascending, obviously. But again, how do you reset based on the number column here? So when it's 2, I want it to reset. So that's when you use the partition clause within a window function. So partition by num, right? So now this is saying for every single instance of num, right? So we're just doing the rank here. Now I'm changing, so I have to do, I have to reset the ranking here. Now we go back to 1. This is going to actually continue for 4, right? Because it's partitioning on 4. It's not, when it's partitioning, it's not necessarily looking at all of the other numbers available. So that's how that works. And we can call this rank. We can give that an alias of rank, and we're pulling from the logs table, right? So now that we have that, again, we talked about, maybe ID could have holes in the data. How do we care for that? We're going to make our own ID column, essentially, right? So we're going to use row number over, and this doesn't, you don't have to have any, essentially any conditions here. If anything, you could just order by ID, because it is in ascending order anyway, but that's probably not necessary. And again, you don't have to partition, because we don't want it to partition, right? We want every single row to just go 1 all the way to, the number of rows that exist for this to work. And then we can name this ID, right? Or name it whatever, and then remove the initial ID. So now we have our own ID, something like this, irrespective of holes. We have the num column, and then we have the rank. And again, the reason we're doing this is so we could compute the difference here and then group by, the number of occurrences of the same values here. So now that I have this, I can compute the difference, but that has to be in a derived table. So we have this derived table here. Now that I have that, I can say, okay, well now, let's maybe have another CTE called differences as, and then we're going to want to select everything. So select everything from my CTE called base. But also, right, so I'm going to have these 3 columns, but I also want the difference now, because now I'm actually able to calculate that. So now I can say, give me everything, but also give me the difference between ID and rank, right? And then maybe name it something like diff, like we did over here. So now we basically have these 4 columns, right? We're looking at these 4 columns all the way to diff. And now is when, you kind of apply that magic that we're looking for. So now that I have these 2 CTEs, I can now say, give me the num, right? Give me this column. Because what I essentially want to do now is, for every combination of number and difference, give me the row count, right? So for a combination of 1 and 0, you're going to see 3 rows. That's why number 1 is what you want to, project. If you were to look at the combination of 1 and 1 over here, that's only going to have 1, so it's not going to count this. That's exactly what we want. We only want to bring in number 1, because you see that only that, based on this table, has 3 consecutive occurrences. So that's why we basically want to group by num and difference in combination, right? So how do we do that? So again, num is going to be that the name of that column, but since we're grouping by diff, we're going to want diff, right? So for every combination of number and diff, give me the count, right? So I could do something like count all, right? And we're pulling from this CTE, the difference CTE, right? And now that I have that, I can say group by num, diff, or group by 1, 2, whatever it is. And then again, we only care about those values where the count of rows is 3 or higher. So now since we're looking at an aggregation, we don't use the where clause, we use having. So having count all, right? So having a count of rows among these combinations greater than or equal to 3, right? And because the output, we only need to have the num column, I'm going to give this an alias of consecutive nums. And since we're grouping anyway, you don't necessarily have to show these values at all. So I can actually just comment that out. And essentially, if we try to run this, that should give us what we want. However, I guess another edge case that we should have thought of was there might actually be instances where you see 1, 1, 1, 1, and then, maybe 10 records down the road, you see that again. You see num 1, 1, 1, 1 again. And if that's the case, you would actually end up with 2 rows showing consecutive nums of 1. So if we only want it to show 1 at a time, we're going to have to use the distinct clause here. So it only counts it once instead of multiple times, because that can happen, and it didn't really indicate that here, but just to kind of treat that as an edge case, that's something we could do. So if we run this and we hit submit, that should do it.